Intro Algebra Lesson 2-5A. We've spent time now dealing with adding and subtracting of positive numbers, and in fact we've switched all subtraction of those numbers and we've changed it into adding the opposite. So we really practiced our addition rules. Those addition rules were that positives plus positives make more positives, negatives plus more negatives make even more negatives, and whenever you have a positive and a negative, you have two questions to ask. One, do I have more positives or negatives? And two, how many more? If we can apply those to our adding and subtracting of positive negative numbers, will be great. Today, we're going to switch and we're going to start talking about multiplication. So with multiplication, we have to remember that multiplication is just repeated addition. And what I mean by that is, if I were to say 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4, you would go, well, 4 plus 4 is 8, 12, 16, 20. That equals 20. But we know that 5 4s also is the same as 20. And I got 5 because there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. So anytime you have multiplication, it's really just the act of repeatedly adding that number. Alright? If that's the case, then you got to think about how positive and negative numbers relate to that. So on page 93, they have a really, kind of convoluted concept when it comes to the multiplication rule. I'm going to try to simplify it as much as possible. And here we have, if the same signs, if you're multiplying two numbers together and they're both positive, or you're multiplying two numbers together and they're both negative, that means they're the same sign. Or if you have a whole bunch of numbers being all multiplied, not addition or subtraction, all multiplied, and you count up all the negatives, and you're like, oh, there's one, there's another one, and another one, and another one, and you count up a number of them that is even, like there's 2 negative signs, 4 negative signs, 6 negative signs. If you have an even number of negative signs, you're going to get a positive answer. It's going to be positive. Okay? If you count up all the signs, or the signs are different, there's two numbers and one's positive and one's negative, it doesn't matter which one's bigger. If they don't have the same sign, then it's going to become a negative. It's going to become a negative when you multiply. Alright? So you don't have to remember anything differently than this. You have to remember that anytime you have the same number of, if you have the same sign or an even, it's positive. If they're different or an odd number of negative signs, then it's going to be negative. And of course, we're going to look at some examples of this so that you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. Now, our first example, we have a negative 8, and a 3. There would only be one negative here. There's one negative. And since there's one negative, that's an odd number of negatives. They're different signs. That means it's going to equal a negative answer. You go ahead and you multiply it like you normally would multiply the numbers. You just have to pay attention to your signs. So since 8 times 3 is 24, and we know our answer is negative because they're different signs, this equals negative 24. And if we have 20 times negative 65, once again, there's only one negative, so that's going to equal a negative answer. Now we just have to multiply them together. Well, we already know it's negative. 2 times 65 is 130. So 20 times 65 is going to be that same 130 with an extra 0 on the end. We would say negative 1,300. We don't need a calculator for these. Alright? Now there's more than two numbers. This time there's 1, 2, 3 negatives. So if there's 3 negatives, that's still an odd number of negatives. It's going to equal a negative answer. Now it doesn't matter. You can multiply in any order you want. So if you want to do 3 times 1 is 3, and then that 3 times 6 is 18, it doesn't matter. It's going to be a negative answer regardless. 6 times 1 is 6, and 6 times 3 is 18. It's going to be negative 18, however you multiply it, as long as you pay attention to your signs. I don't care if there's more positives than negatives. That doesn't matter. That's an addition rule. For multiplication, you count up how many negatives you have. Alright? Now this one has a fraction in it, but that's okay. First of all, I see 2 negative signs in this entire problem. Since there are 2 negatives, the answer is going to be positive. We already know that. The rest of it doesn't matter. You can do it any way you want. So if you want to do 3 times 5 and then that times the 3 over 5, it doesn't matter. I make them all fractions. So I would just say, let's move this down, and I'll go over 1 over 1. Whenever you have something on the top and the bottom, they can cancel out, like this 5 is on the bottom of the fraction, so it can cancel out with a 5 that's on the top. Now I'm really just left with a 3 and a 3. I already know the answer is positive, so I'm not worried about the signs, and 3 times 3 is equal to 9. So I would say it's positive 9. Now you could go 3 times 5 is 15, and 15 times 3 is 45, but 45 divided by that 5 is going to still equal the 9, and I know it's positive because of the number of signs. Now, what if you don't know one of the numbers? Well, right now it's a positive t. There's only one negative. There's one negative, so the answer is going to equal negative. And if it's multiplication, you don't need the parentheses. We always put the number before the letter. You can just say that's negative 5t. You don't need to keep the parentheses. We're not going to do anything else. We're not adding them. That's as far as we can go. All right? In this particular problem, you have 2 negatives. So that's going to equal a positive. And you can multiply in any order you want to, and they don't have to have like parts to multiply. So you already know it's a positive answer. 3 times 4 makes 12, and 12 times y would be 12y. And it's positive. I already know that because there are 2 negatives in the problem. Now you'll notice the absolute value brackets. I have to do everything inside the brackets first. Inside the bracket there is 1 negative. So that means it's going to equal a negative answer. I already know that. Multiply in any order you want. 2 times 3 is 6, 6 times 4 is 24. 4 times 3 is 12, 12 times 2 is 24. 2 times 4 is 8, 8 times 3 is 24. It doesn't matter how you multiply it, there's 1 negative, so this is actually the absolute value of negative 24. But we know what absolute value means. It's the distance from 0. So negative 24 is 24 units away from 0. This would actually equal positive 24. So we're putting all the stuff we know. We got rules for multiplication, positive and negative numbers. We have absolute value. We know how to deal with that. All right? Here's a whole bunch of r's. But if you count, there's 1, 2, 3 negatives. 3 negatives are going to equal a negative answer. There's only a 3, so there's nothing else that 3 can multiply by. But anytime you have r times itself, you're dealing with exponents. So you could say the answer is negative 3r cubed. The answer is going to be negative. Go ahead and cube whatever r is, multiply it by the 3, and it's got to be a negative number. All right? If you recall, some of these properties were also properties for addition. So properties of multiplication like commutative, the order doesn't matter. For the associative, it has to do with parentheses. Property of opposites, when we multiply numbers by a negative 1, it's going to give us another value that's opposite of it. And the property of 0, which is a really hard one. Multiply by 0 and you always get 0. So here is an example of the commutative property, where the order doesn't matter. 5, 3, 2, 3, 5, 2. Order doesn't matter. And the associative property, the order stays the same. 5, 3, 2, 5, 3, 2. But the parentheses are around different numbers. The property of opposites, taking any number, multiplying it by a negative 1, will change its sign. Always changes the sign. If this were negative 1 times a negative r, it would have become positive r. It will change the sign of whatever you multiply that negative 1 by. And the property of 0, the all-time hardest, if you multiply something by 0, you're going to get 0. Anything times 0 is 0. So again, remember these rules. They're the most important. Count up how many signs you have. If you have an even number of signs, it's positive. If you have a negative number of negative signs, it's going to be negative. Don't mix up the addition rules. These are different types of rules.